Welcome to part 4 of our Biosphere series of lectures. This is part 4 of 4, and we are going to talk about biodiversity, species loss, and ecosystem function, and then we will transition into a coverage of soils. So, most people understand that biodiversity in general terms as the number and mix of plant and animal species that occurs in a given place. Scientists are more precise and include more in that definition. So I'm going to go ahead and enlarge this figure that we see here. And we're going to start in the upper left-hand corner, and I want you to appreciate that this graphic is showing that all of these things are related and interconnected in our global world. We've talked a lot about these different components of functional diversity, and it's the biological and chemical processes such as energy flow and matter recycling needed for the survival of species, communities, and ecosystems. And so part of the main objective of this course is to study natural environments and resource management using mapping and cartography, and this is all necessary to consider when you're approaching conservation issues and trying to solve problems and using maps as a tool in that puzzle to solve those problems. And so that's why we've gone through this background on these types of processes. So we covered the different types of food webs where solar energy is the main input. We have our producers, our consumers, and then our decomposers. And then the flow of abiotic chemicals, carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, minerals, and I would include water throughout the system. Always there's a loss of heat in the transfer of energy, and all of these things interact in every system or ecosystem. If we go over to the right and think about ecological diversity, this is the variety of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems found in an area or on the earth. And while these are very different, we have a temperate forest, a dry area with mountains in the background. This would be a high desert. And then we have chaparral, which is very characteristic of Southern California and other parts of Mediterranean climates. So they appear different and they look different in form and function, but they all do have very similar functional diversity needs with different kinds of varieties and examples in them. Species diversity is the number of species present in different habitats. And so we can appreciate that there is a higher species diversity here in this tropical representation than, say, here in a high desert. And then finally, the concept of genetic diversity is important for looking at sustainability. The variety of genetic materials available within a species or population is very crucial for the survival of that population. The more genetic diversity you have, the more variation in individuals, the more resilient that community is going to be. So you can appreciate that if you have resilience in a community and part of that community is eliminated or wiped out, I shouldn't say community, I should say population. I should go down a level. When we're talking about genetics, it's the population. So within that population, if something occurs to impact it, say a infestation of the pine beetle in the Pacific Northwest. If you had a lot of genetic diversity, you would have more resilience and the ability of trees to bounce back from that kind of infestation. So, two ways to measure biodiversity: species richness and species diversity. So, richness is the different species, the number of different types, and species diversity measures both richness and relative abundance. So A and B have the same type of species, so the same species richness. And A has a higher species diversity because the relative abundance of species are more similar. When we think about how to approach conservation problems. You will read in the literature, hopefully, and see the term drivers of change. And this has to do with the things that are impacting our ecosystems and that we need to address in order to achieve sustainability. So, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature is a group that coordinates efforts to catalog and preserve biodiversity worldwide. And they have a definition of biodiversity as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. So, this includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. We've covered natural resources already, looking at habitats, ecosystems, and the connectivity. We've touched briefly upon protected lands, and these all collectively make up what we call natural resources. We have also covered the benefits of these resources. There's a great benefit to exploring wild spaces and places. We rely on natural resources for our medicines and our other types of things that we consume, including plants, animals, and also the oxygen that we breathe, and the air being clean and water being clean as well. So, the drivers of change, these are things that need to be looked at in order to preserve ecosystems and achieve sustainability. Land management. How are we managing our natural resources? Invasive species. This is a huge problem where man's activities are bringing species into ecosystems where they don't have any or much competition, and so they overpopulate and then they destroy that environment. We saw the example of the reintroduction of the wolf into Yellowstone. So that's not an invasive species, but it was actually a success story. In if you introduce a species that doesn't belong in that environment and it doesn't have natural checks and balances, it will overpopulate without check. And there's a lot of invasive species problems with plankton coming over in the ballast water of ships. And so the zebra mussel infestation in the United States is coming from ballast water from overseas, primarily Asia. And the ships that come over, they release their water, and the plankton are viable. So the plankton for these mussels get a hold in U.S. waterways and clog up and destroy our native species. That's just one example. Pollution is a driver of change. As you can appreciate by this image here, pollution does not stay where it's created. Even solid disposed waste doesn't stay always where we want to dispose of it. And you can think of not only air pollution, but also chemicals and waste in our waterways and air. And then recreation overuse. So we have recreation as a benefit because of the combinations of a very large population, our technology, and also a money driven economy. It is very common for some resources to be overused and then they are damaged, and you get too many people who are not caring properly for the resource, and that can be problematic. Okay, let's look at this example of a dry forest and savanna in Brazil. This is known as the Cerrado, and there are over 10,000 species of plants, 200 species of mammals, 600 species of birds, and 800 species of fish that call this area of Brazil home. And this is their habitat. Very, very, very rich in biodiversity, one of the most dense areas of the world, hosting a very complex interaction among different populations. So, this community is very diverse and very resilient to change. One of the problems with this area of Brazil is that it's also ideal for growing crops and raising cattle. And there's been a huge movement of deforestation in order for companies, primarily from the United States, to come in and establish their different agriculture crops and a lot of cattle ranches to raise beef for the United States mostly. And there is a mass destruction that happens in areas like this, and it eliminates lots of habitat. So when we look at species loss and decline, the overwhelming message, according to the 2008 Red List, is that the world is losing species and that the rate of loss appears to be accelerating in many taxonomic groups. The reason I give you a 2008 reference is that this was about the time when everyone in the scientific community really began to accept that amphibians are showing us that canary in a coal mine type of analogy. That if you don't know the story, miners used to take canaries with them because they were very, very vulnerable to the gases in the coal mine, and the canary would stop singing and then die very quickly if the air was poisoned, and the canaries would show signs far earlier than the miners would. So the canary in a coal mine reference means if the canary dies, we all have to get out of here. And so the canary in the coal mine, when we look at the loss of species worldwide, is that if we have amphibians being lost at a tremendous rate, it means that the ecosystem is not able to sustain this type of animal. We're not just talking about one species, we're talking about a very large taxonomic group. And so if you think about the ecosystem can no longer be a viable habitat for an entire taxonomic group, then we have a problem. And it isn't going to be very long before the other taxonomic groups are affected as well. And because of their amphibious nature, they need water and land resources to live, and a very narrow range of temperatures because they are ectotherms, and they rely on heat sources from the external environment, meaning they do not create heat from energy from the food that they eat. They need the environment to be a certain narrow range of temperatures. So because of that, they're very vulnerable to climate change. Any major shifts in temperature, in water resources, in water quality, in air quality, because they also breathe through their skin. So they are that canary in the coal mine, meaning they're going to show climate change impacts very, very quickly. And that's why so many of them are critically endangered, and vulnerable. We can also see mammals and birds are also high on the list, as are reptiles and fishes. Now, it doesn't mean that insects, mollusks, and plants aren't important. It means that they, in general, are not as susceptible to the effects of climate change. They are susceptible, but they won't react until it gets even worse. And so let's look, for example, if we just consider rising temperatures, okay. Mollusks are pretty resilient to rising temperatures. They generally tend to live in shallow ocean waters, and with global climate change, the waters are changing, uh, but the temperatures do change, and the mollusks are pretty resilient to that temperature change. In the same ecosystem, if we were to do a comparison study of the decline of mollusks versus the decline of coral reefs, that same change, if we just look at rising temperatures, is not sustainable for our coral reefs. Coral reefs need a very narrow range of temperatures to thrive, and when the water gets warmer, they do not survive it. So with global warming, we're losing a lot of coral reefs to that temperature change. So this infographic is looking at the idea of a sixth mass extinction. And so some scientists are saying we're on the verge of a sixth mass extinction, not caused by a meteorite or the fall of dinosaurs and the rise of mammals, but we are looking at ecosystem loss and alteration caused by human activity. In fact, the International Union for Conservation of Nature evaluated over 50,000 species depicted here. Keep in mind, each symbol represents 100 species, not individuals, so they are representative of species within that taxonomic group. Threatened are shown in red, non-threatened are shown in black. So let's start with the group that's doing the best. Relatively, birds are doing better than mammals and amphibians. And what does that mean? 99% of known species were assessed in among bird populations, and they determined that only 13% are threatened. Now, I say only with a caveat. It's still a problem. But compared to mammals and amphibians, birds are more versatile and more adaptable. And if you think about that, if you needed an animal to switch its home range, a bird is going to have more flexibility in general than mammals would or amphibians. In fact, birds perform the longest known migrations on the planet, and they are a lot of birds are very migratory in nature, and so they are able to survive some of these pressures. And a bird with its flight capabilities is adaptable as well, and also because of their physiology, with being protected from the environment. Let's say if you compared a bird with an amphibian, birds are feathered and they can get energy from food, the metabolism of food, whereas amphibians have a very thin skin that they use as a respiratory or breathing organ, and they cannot get heat from the metabolism of food. They need the environment to stay within a certain range. Okay. If we look at mammals, 25% of the mammal species were threatened. That's a fourth of all the mammals are threatened. That means that they are struggling to survive in various degrees. Amphibians is 41%. So again, that canary in the coal mine, we have almost half of the world's amphibians are in danger of becoming extinct. So, extinction is the global loss of a species. Elimination at a local level would be called extirpation. So, this poses a threat to the integrity and sustainability of the ecosystem. We talked before about why should we care about losing a certain type of fish or maybe a certain type of owl. And that was a very common question in the United States in political history, that when there was a lot of conservation efforts to save the spotted owl in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of politicians said, we have families to feed. We need to keep people in jobs, and we're threatening the livelihood of these families if we protect this owl. And it's really missing the point that as humans, we need to find a way to coexist with these different representatives of our ecosystem. It's not just that the owls were being killed. It was a bigger picture that we're living in such a way that we're destroying habitat, and what else are we doing that is not so visible right in front of our face? And that is the message that conservationists stayed consistent with, is it's not about raising an alarm about one particular kind of animal. And it's not just that animal lovers need to be appeased with saving these types of animals. It is a very serious indication of a problem when we are destroying these ecosystems, because we rely on them as well, and we can't just rely on them for money in the bank. That's a problem, because there is a disconnect between the value and function of that ecosystem if we only look at the resource being the money from the timber. It ignores the integrity and sustainability of that ecosystem that we need to protect. So, wiping out or eliminating something specific at a local or smaller scale than global is considered extirpation. You'll see it often called extinction, and for scientific definitions, it's a little bit more refined to distinguish those two. If a bird species is forced into extinction by a logging company, and It no longer has habitat because the trees were cut down in the rainforest. That's extirpation. Again, why does this concern people? I may be preaching to the choir. I hope that I am, but you may not understand, or you might think, why should I care? Well, the loss of ecological services and the products and processes associated with the biological systems are crucial to the balance and well being if we think about a system as being open and a lot of flux, a lot of flow. So, an incomplete list of the services and products that we rely on are the formation of soil, cycling of nutrients, provisioning of food, fresh water, fuel, fiber, and recreation opportunities, and then the regulation of climate, flooding, and disease. So, there's no way that any human on the planet can say that this doesn't concern me, because it concerns all of us. If we look at these four pillars, of services, looking at provisioning, supporting, regulating, and cultural, we can break it down like the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment did in 2005 to specific types. So, with provisioning, we're thinking about food production, water, wood, and fiber, and fuel. Our supporting services are nutrient cycling, soil formation, which we will close up today's lecture with a lengthy discussion about primary production and habitat provision. Our regulating services, this is long term, this is big picture, climate regulation, flood regulation, water purification. So, an example of water purification with the loss of wetlands. We are seeing an increasing influx of pollution into our oceans because the wetlands acted like a big sponge and they would absorb a lot of toxic chemicals that were coming off of land runoff. Well, when you eliminate the wetland, you have a faster flow of water right into our oceans. And so you get more pollution problems in shallow environments after the wetland is destroyed. Um, Cultural services are spiritual, aesthetic, educational, and recreational. So these may not get high priority, and in our society for a long time, they weren't always considered at the same time as looking at sustainability and our economy. But I think people are beginning to embrace that if you ignore those human qualities, they are human needs. And if you want to do more than just survive, if you want to thrive and live in such a way that you're not just in existence mode, you need to pay attention to these things. So while that forest might be appealing if you look at it and say, I could make a lot of money off of the timber, there may be a lot of people in the community that rely on the aesthetic beauty of that forest. And if it were gone, they would suffer. And that is something that should not be taken lightly. It is important for our well being as humans, and it is a factor in looking at sustainability. I'm not going to read all of this to you. I just want to drive home the message that it's complex. So when we talk about trying to achieve sustainability and trying to live in a way that makes sense for the well-being of and the functioning of the planet, it is a very, very complex thing. That's why people devote their entire careers to it, and you really cannot look at one factor in isolation. I've mentioned before that we do graphs and we look at maps in terms of isolating factors and looking at them and considering them in maybe one data set, maybe two or three, maybe a model of five or six. And that's a beginning launching pad. It's a starting point. It's a base point for us to begin the discussion. And that's how we understand the world, is chunking it out a little bit at a time. But it's important also to appreciate the Zeitgeist, which is a German term for the whole, and that all of these factors are important in ecosystem services. Can we put an economic value on nature? Well, it's complex. Even this estimate says, and this is from 2010, one global estimate puts the value of these services at 16 to 64 trillion annually. Now, that is a huge, huge gap between 16 trillion and 64 trillion. It means that that says to me, if I really think about what those numbers mean, there's no agreement. on how much value nature has. And I think it speaks to the idea that you really can't put a price on it. Now, sometimes we have to, and we certainly have to make decisions based on economy, but you should never, ever neglect the value of nature and just look at the bottom line dollar amount that can be extracted from a resource, because there are a lot of what are called hidden costs or long-term costs. So one example, if you, let's say that you had, on a very small scale, you had a population of fish that were available to you in this particular bay that had some coral reefs in it. And there was this really exotic species of fish. And the local community decided they wanted that kind of fish for sushi. And so you started harvesting that resource. Well, you might be able to harvest, let's say, 100 fish a day, and the population would survive for a while, but would it be sustainable? And so just in this made up hypothetical example, no. So what would happen is after a certain number of days, all the fish are gone. So this has been known for a long time, and you would then try to approach it with maximum sustainable yield. How many of those fish can I take per day in a way that will sustain the resource? Now, that's not the same thing as how many fish am I capable of taking a day. You in your this little small example might be able to get 100 of them a day, but the population would crash. So there are specific scientific studies that would say, well, maybe you can take 20 a day and it's sustainable. And that is the idea, flow of nutrients and energy into and out of the system. And we definitely know that human activities affect soil development. Okay. Here is a diagram representing some of the processes that are working in this cubical representation of soil. So I'm going to start at the bottom. Here we have our nematodes, which a lot of people call worms, and these are microorganisms that help cycle nutrients. There's also bacteria and fungi at work. Here's a representation of some fungi that's binding soil particles together, adding organic matter to the soil, and this helps to cycle nutrients. We have insects, invertebrates, and mammals that are making their home in the soil that are represented here by our friendly little invertebrate guy and a mammal that has been burrowing in the soil. This is really an important process for cycling that soil. If you've ever churned or turned over your soil in your garden, or if you think about the plowing that is done in between growing cycles, and that is the process of turning things up and aerating the soil. And mammals help do that in natural environments. People don't tend to like them in their yards very much. There's an ongoing battle with me and my husband. I don't want him to do anything to the gophers that like to live on our property, and he doesn't agree with me. So we kind of disagree on that topic. I just make sure I'm not anywhere near the property when he decides to take care of it. I don't want to know about it. I guess that maybe that I need to think about that, is that denial of one of the things we're talking about in sustainability in this course. But I digress. So back to our soil sample. We have earthworms, and they increase soil porosity, the same idea as the mammals, and they're moving through the soil column you can see here. And as they consume that dirt and debris, and they are actually cycling the nutrients through the system. We have plant litter. Dying plants add organic matter to the soil. And we talked about nitrification in an earlier slide, and we didn't really focus on this is done by bacteria that live in the root nodes, and here is an artist representation of what that might look like. So these are the bacteria are doing the fixing of the nitrogen. Natural soil formation factors include weathering of rocks that provides raw material. We get parent material as a determination for the resulting soil type. And we'll look later at the categorization of clay, silt, and sand. And so the parent material where that weathering is being in flux, it affects the soil type. Climate is a major influence, and climate is categorized by many factors. The two primary ones are water and temperature. And biological activity is important for soil, as is topography and slope and time. We're going to see an example of topography. It's the lay of the land, and slope is how steep something is. So here is that example that I mentioned. The topography would be the shape and the formations on the land. So here we have a valley, and we have plateaus that we can see in this image, along with some mountainous regions and high rugosity or high complexity on some of the slopes, and then flatter or less rugosity on the other slopes. The thicker soils develop on the plateaus and in the valleys. This is because of the deposition of nutrients in the valleys, and in the plateaus we don't have as much runoff, so you get thicker soil that is allowed to develop. On the slopes, you can appreciate that the soils are thinner because erosion, primarily in runoff from precipitation and the loss due to wind activity, will make the soils thinner. On the north-facing slopes, there's more moisture than on the south-facing slopes, and this has to do with the direction and fall of precipitation in this ecosystem. Here is a drawing. This is an aerial image on the top. At the bottom, we see a drawing, and it's showing you that on the steep slope, there are, in fact, places where there's no soil at all. It is too steep for soil to take a foothold and remain. There are places on this, what would be a mountain structure, that do have soil, as evidenced by the vegetation. The flat slope has thick soil. And then if we consider the lower part of this surface portion, we have a shallow slope and it's poor, patchy mountain soil. In the lowland valley, we have very thick and rich soil. And this not only has to do with the deposition of the materials, but it has to do with the nature of the shape of this valley, and so soils have a chance to accumulate, and they're very thick, and then they're rich in nutrients because they're infused with the deposition of materials that come down through the water source. And then we have deeply weathered bedrock here, represented underneath this plateau. One thing to note here as well is that along a river system, you will find a lot of vegetation, and it's not just because the availability of water, because there is in many areas a lot of available water under the surface, which is our subsurface water or groundwater, but there might be a lack of nutrients. And so in some environments, the combination of nutrients and water makes it ideal for growing. So humans have a great impact on soils in many areas. It can take up to 500 years to create a few centimeters through geological processes, but in farming, we can lose soil much faster than it is forming. In fact, we could eliminate many acres of topsoil in 500 minutes, even less than that. So the time scale of formation and poor farming practices is in no way in balance if we use farming practices that were common in the early 1900s. So in dry regions, this can lead to desertification, and there is pressure from overgrazing, deforestation, and the salination of the soil, which is where the extraction of water leaves a high mineral content or a salty soil base, and that pH is not ideal for growing at some point. So with sustainable practices, you can use plowing on the contour or the reduction of plowing. There is something called no-till agriculture, and this reduces moisture loss, soil erosion, and encourages root growth. So this is an example of a definitely non-sustainable practice. You can see that this is in the middle of what was intended to be a field, and there was a tremendous erosion event. I don't know if it happened all at once. It does look like there were some um, pretty sudden evidence here of sudden movement, but it does look like there are also gradual changes that happen where this is no longer suitable for growing crops anymore. And so the whole idea of sustainable is that whatever practice they were doing in this field didn't work in the long run. No-till farming, as shown in A on the left, leads to greater moisture retention and looser soils, and it allows wheat to develop longer root systems that access moisture and nutrients farther below the surface. So they have a greater amount of soil that is available to them, they being the plants, because they have a stronger, longer root system. Conventional farming is not the same because heavy tractors will till or plow the soil and break it up, and this leads to compaction and shorter root systems. If we look at a map of the world, and the data set being displayed here is a high risk of human-induced desertification. So the main causes of desertification are the overuse of water in an area and the reduction of the water table. So there is a cascade of events that happen, but basically when the water is extracted from an ecosystem and it is extracted at a rate that's not replenishable, you will get the water table is dropping, and this goes beyond the extraction of just surface water. So surface water is a continual problem, or the reduction of surface water, especially in the Pacific and southern areas of western United States. And so the Colorado River no longer reaches the ocean, and there's a great pressure where you see a lot of these orange areas because of farming practices. And what happens is that farmers are utilizing water according to land ownership, and that doesn't always lead to a balanced use of that resource. Scientists will look at soil horizons, and there are soil profiles, which are vertical sections of soil from the surface down to the deepest roots or bedrock. Soil classification done with a PADON, which is a 3D soil profile, and then soil horizons are visible horizontal layers in a profile. They categorize different types of soil or different areas using letters, which we'll look at in the next slide, and the boundaries reflect differences in color, texture, structure, moisture, and other properties. In this soil padon, we see that an artist's rendition is showing the different soil horizons, O, A, E, B, C, and R. True soil is soil that is considered to be accessible for plants, and R is here showing a rock bottom, and C is the horizon that is made of weathered bedrock and parent material. So here's what it would look like: an idealized soil profile and a healthy system. And then on the right is an actual picture of a cross section. And we can see that we have our topsoil represented by O and A. And then we have the E horizon, which is sand, silt, and leaching materials. In the B horizon, we are now seeing clays, aluminum, and iron accumulate. It's often yellow or reddish because of these clays, aluminum, and iron deposits. And then the C horizon is the weathered bedrock. It is made of the parent material and the breakdown of materials higher up. Soil fertility is the ability of soil to grow plants, and one of the properties of soil that indicates not only type but health is the color. And the chemical makeup determines the color of soil. It's very typical in the southeast US to have red and yellow soil, and this comes from iron oxides. In the prairies, it is typical to find black soil, which is nutrient rich, but black is not necessarily tied to only healthy soil, because tropical soil has a low organic content and it's very black. So the tropics are adapted for plants to grow very, very quickly. Most of the biomass is not in the root system. Most of the biomass is in the above ground because of the high amounts of sunlight and precipitation. The plants grow very quickly. Water is not a limiting factor in the tropics, but sunlight is. And so the plants will shoot up very, very quickly, and most of their biomass is above ground. And the soils tend to be very depleted because in that system, everything is growing very lushly above the soil. So here is an example of a field geologist or botanist that is looking at some chunk of soil, and they're comparing it to a field guide of soil colors. And this is a soil color chart, and they're doing some assessment on the nature of that soil. Other soil characteristics can be plotted on a triangular analysis, which compares the relative percentages of clay, silt, and sand. I don't expect you to memorize this, but I want you to understand if we look at silt, it is not surprisingly mostly silt, and it can get down to 0% sand and also 0% clay. So this uh, tan portion of the triangle is representing what would be categorized as silt. If we look at something categorized as silt loam, it is going to have silt, but it's going to have a little bit of sand here, and it will have also starting to get potentially some clay mixed into it. And then certainly when we go into the middle, clay loam has a combination of clay, silt, and sand in it. And so this is a categorization scheme in order to define these different percentages of samples of soil. If we look at the physical properties of structure, and this refers to size and shape of soil, common categorizations are crumb or granular, platy, prismatic or columnar, and blocky. You can appreciate just by looking at the images that this would be a softer, more porous type of soil than the blocky, which looks like it's very hard. And this would be a much better environment for plants to have a root system established than this one. There's also physical properties of consistence, porosity, and moisture. And consistence has to do with cohesion of soil. Porosity is the spaces between soil that control the flow of water and air. And then moisture, plants grow best when the soil is at field capacity. Holding the maximum water available for plant use after the water has drained is a high capacity situation. Okay, sorry about that. I had to check the time limit on the video. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay, a few more properties of soil and we'll wrap up this lecture. And colloids are tiny particles of clay or organic matter. They attract chemicals critical to plant growth, and without them, leaching would occur or the loss of nutrients from the system. So water dissolves important chemicals and makes them unavailable to plants, and that is one of the main functions of a wetland, is to dissolve harmful chemicals. Acidity and alkalinity refer to the pH of the soil, and we can look here at a representation of the uptake of different types of minerals and nutrients into the root hairs of a plant. And the composition of the soil, in this case, a clay particle, is going to have various degrees of potassium, calcium, magnesium, aluminum, and sodium that are available for this plant. And the acidity of soil has to do with either acid or alkali, is also called basic. And this is referring to the pH or the relative amounts of hydrogen, and there are ideal conditions for different crops in general. Very, very basic or alkali soils are not good for plants, and neither are very acidic soils. And so there is an ideal range that is conducive to plant growth. Okay, this ends our lecture for part 4. Thank you for your attention.